And a huge thank you to Hend and PMHQ for inviting me. I'm super excited to chat with you all today. Today I'm going to chat with you guys about how to effectively communicate with product designers. So before we dive in, to just kind of formally introduce myself, I'm Michelle. I'm currently a principal designer on the design systems team at Vista. You guys may know it more famously as Vistaprint, but trying to use the official Vista name now that we've changed it officially. But even though my title says design, my role is actually fairly hybrid, and my responsibilities are fairly consistently split between product design, product management, and also design ops. And in fact, my career overall has been fairly hybrid as well. With almost every design role that I've had, I've also either officially or unofficially taken on product management responsibilities. And so as a result, I've really been able to practice how I communicate with other product designers based on two things. A, how I personally wished others would communicate with me as a designer, and B, how I've personally seen really great results using these different communication tactics with other designers as a product manager. And before I begin, a total disclaimer, I should say that this is just my perspective from my own personal experiences. So what I say is, of course, not the only way to communicate with designers. And if you don't feel like a suggestion is right for you and your team, then of course, feel free to adapt. I'm going to go into a couple of stories of what's worked for me personally, but everyone is different. Every team is different. So, take it with a grain of salt if you need. And I'll, obviously, hopefully be able to provide you guys with some good ideas. So by means of an agenda, we'll first start out by learning what a product designer is, followed by the different roles and skill sets within the product design field. We'll then dive into a couple of how-tos, specifically in communication overall, how to handle design critiques, and how to resolve conflicts with designers. Then we'll end with what to do if all of the above doesn't work, and I'll leave time at the end for any questions that you may have. So let's dive in. Okay, so to start, what is a product designer? If you Google what is a product designer, you'll probably get a whole plethora of different answers and definitions, all of which are probably true. But at its most simplified core, product designers, in essence, are problem solvers, right? They help users get from point A to point B to essentially accomplish the tasks that they need or want to accomplish with the least amount of friction and frustration possible. They are very user-centric and are often thought of as the voice of or the advocate for the customer. And in addition, they also work to solve business problems. So they look at how the user experiences that they create also can help to improve business metrics, like, for example, revenue or engagement. So a lot of times they will be juggling the user needs with also the business stakeholder needs and trying to figure out how they can kind of tie that all together visually or otherwise to, again, just help users accomplish the task that they need with the product at hand. Designers often solve problems visually, as I mentioned, but not always. So sometimes their solutions deal with a process change, or perhaps it's a content change, or maybe even a structural or architectural change. Think of things like navigation, wayfinding, things of that nature. But either way, regardless, they often follow some version, not always exactly to a T, but some version of the design thinking methodology to accomplish the task on hand. And so you can see, hopefully on the screen, this is a graphic I pulled from the Nielsen Norman Group. This is what I always refer to as design thinking. I love it. I love the process. This is kind of a bit of a spoiler for what's to come, but the way that I usually approach communicating with designers is very similar to the way that I would approach solving a problem for any one of my users, which is why this theme is going to come up again and again in my presentation, really starting with, just understanding designers and understanding our customers and users all the way through implementing everything that you've learned. And so before we get into some of the how-tos, one other thing I want to really stress about product designers is that product design isn't just one thing, right? It's not a monolith. Someone can call themselves a product designer and mean something totally different than what another person refers to themselves as a product designer. There are many different specialties within the product design realm, and each of these specialties may take part in a different part of the design thinking process. So because in the industry roles and responsibilities aren't so clearly defined, You may actually find that at smaller companies, you have one person who is both a UX and a UI designer, while at larger companies, those roles may be actually like two or more separate people. So try not to get too hung up on who exactly does what, but just note that within the world of product design comes many different skill sets. And with that comes many different ideas for how to communicate with them, which is actually why I mention it. So I think I mentioned this all because I think that one of the most important lessons that I personally learned when learning how to most effectively communicate with designers is that there is no one size fits all with a communication strategy. Everybody's different. Everyone has different ways of working, different ways of communicating, and different ways of receiving feedback. So it can actually be really beneficial to first empathize with them, just like we saw in the last slide of, the first phase of design thinking, and in a way almost conduct informal user interviews with them so you can understand how they work, and from there you can figure out a way to best help them. So it's really great if you can try to understand what they value. Ask them questions like, do they prefer blunt feedback, or do they maybe need a compliment sandwich? Do they do better with talking things through, or is it maybe easier for them to read requirements in a written format so they have it to reference later? All these questions and all these things may seem pretty basic, but the more you understand about your designers and about the answers to these questions, the more likely it is that you can put together a plan and be able to make decisions about how you guys work together and how to get the most out of your time with them, both when you're meeting with them and when they're in heads downtime. And I say this because when I'm talking about communication, I'm not just talking about a Zoom conversation or a Slack message. I'm talking about any communication touch point that you have with your designers. So meetings, agendas, design critiques, stand-ups, demos, one-on-one catch-ups, maybe instructional videos that you put together about a design brief, right? Any place where you're really communicating a message with them, either verbally or non-verbally. And so by learning about them, it's more likely that you'll build trust with them by taking the time to show them that you really care, and you'll be able to see much better results because, again, you're communicating using that same language that they have communicated with you. They really respond well to. So as a personal example, I did this with the team of designers at my last job that I worked with. And I found that it didn't only help me craft a better relationship and working strategy with them, but just in general, I got to know them, and that was really nice, especially during the pandemic when we're, all remote. And before speaking with them, I was really trying to figure out a weekly schedule. How would our team operate, right? For example, how often did we need to meet as a team? How often did they want feedback or larger updates from outside the team, things like that. I was trying to figure it out on my own, and that was probably my biggest mistake because it was really hard to kind of come up with something. I was flying blind because I didn't know what they needed and what they wanted from me. And so after having spoken with them, those conversations that I had enabled me to put together an operational weekly plan for what we wanted to do every week and how we wanted to do it and accomplish those things super quickly. And I also had a crystal clear idea of how they wanted me as a product manager to communicate with them and what they wanted to be doing with their days and also just in general their careers, because they told me, right? They gave me that direct input. And it was just like a user interview in that sense. They shared where I could be of greater help and honestly where I couldn't. And we were really able to kind of dig in and work together pretty well from there. Which brings me to my next point, which is play to each other's strengths. So hopefully during these get to know one another conversations, you'll also start to learn what they like doing, what they don't like doing, what they want to be doing, and where their strengths and weaknesses lie, as well as also identifying your own. So a couple of slides ago, we saw that the world of product design is split between many different skill sets. You and your designer may find that you have some skills in common and some differences as well, because of course, sometimes the world between design and product can get a little bit fuzzy and have, a little bit of an overlap. And so it's really nice to be able to identify what those things are. It's helpful to note this also because you can, once you've identified, these kind of differences and similarities, you can really better divide and conquer on a sprint or work together to get something done faster on a sprint. Another personal example, there was one time I was working as a product manager, and my designer and I realized that he was much, much better at putting together a user interview script. Well, I was much better at the logistics of user recruitment, of scheduling, and follow-ups. And so to save us time, he wrote the script and prepared to conduct all these interviews, while at the same time, I scheduled all the sessions. And so actually, because we did that in parallel, we ended up saving a lot of time because we identified where we were able to use our complementary skill sets to work together instead of just one person doing all the work and taking a lot longer to do so. And I think that we both really appreciated what the other person was able to bring to the table. And we had really solid communication through that whole thing because we had already identified what we're good at, what we need help with, and just kind of moving forward from there. So again, here in this example, you can see that early communication and even just those informal, like quote unquote, user interviews, designer interviews can lead to greater team productivity and even team building in some instances. This next point may not seem like such a big deal, but it's my personal favorite. I have found that it's been tremendously helpful in building trust with designers and just creating a really positive, iterative, exploratory design culture. And that is that when you're in design critiques and you don't necessarily think something works, which is totally fine, state it in the form of a question. So oftentimes as a designer, I have received feedback that is wildly unhelpful. And that's not necessarily because the feedback itself, wasn't valid. It was because I never really knew where the person was coming from with that feedback. So I didn't know what to do with it. It wasn't actionable. And all I really wanted to do was just get the job done and do it well. And a lot of that relied on me receiving meaningful feedback. When you give feedback in the form of a question, it opens up the door for discussion around the changes that you would like to see. And then therefore the designer can actually do something with that. So let me explain. In the example here on the screen, and this is a totally, completely fake example that I mocked up. Hypothetically speaking, your designer has just shown you this Google homepage that they're working on, right? Still in progress. And let's say you don't like it, don't think it works. That's totally fine. You think, for instance, that the gray buttons, over here, if you could see my cursor, you think that maybe they're just too light. Now, if you were to say that in a sentence, right? This is too light, I don't like it, or this is too light, it doesn't work. That's not necessarily actionable because the designer doesn't know why it doesn't work, right? So you may get a slightly defensive response, or you may just get a non-committal response, maybe something like, oh, I'm still playing around with it, or maybe the designer may ask you why. But either way, the designer is really wondering why you're asking them to do this change, or it's not really even a question, right? Why you're kind of stating this. And the designer may not know how to fix it. And that's the end of the conversation. But if you were to reword your feedback as a question, potentially from the user's point of view, maybe something like, does the light gray meet accessibility standards? Or will users be able to easily see this button? That is very, very different. You're now saying why you don't like that gray, and that why will really help the designer know how to change it, because you've just made that feedback actionable. So you're saying the same thing. So you're not babying them, you're not shying away from giving feedback, and you're still getting your point across, but in a way that opens up the conversation to discuss and talk about other potential options, because again, you've asked a question that the designer can do something with that can really, open up again that door for communication. If you ask something like, oh, does the light gray meet accessibility standards? Then the designer could say, oh, well, what are our accessibility standards? Or maybe let's take a look and let's test it and see. So it really starts to form that great dialogue, and you're talking about the user as well, which is always a really good thing. I've worked on several teams that have taken this approach to design critiques and love it. Every single time, the amount of in-progress work that designers have shared has increased significantly because the culture changed to be more constructive and actionable, and the designers were just getting more valuable feedback to work with and iterate on. And as kind of another another positive, it's actually helped us to work faster because we're making really smart design changes much earlier on. So, you're not getting too far down the rabbit hole of design or even finished, and, you have to kind of go back and, and just redo something later on. It's also often helped us uncover other UX issues that we didn't think of. And as a product manager in that role, it really helped me to think about why I'm requesting a change so that I can prioritize what I'm asking them to do, right? Because, of course, as product managers, we want to really use our team's time and resources very well. And so since prioritization is a big part of that, this just reframing feedback in the form of a question really helped me personally with that prioritization piece. So on the flip side, you bring up your feedback, you have a great discussion about it, but in the end, you still disagree, which is totally fine. And that happens, right? What do you do? So in this case, I would try to let the user be your guide. So whether that's through quotes from user interviews, behavioral trends from usability tests, or even quantitative data from A/B test, whatever data you can point to both come to a mutual conclusion is great. Now, there may be times where you don't have enough data or you have conflicting data and it's not as easy to resolve. But if you do have the time and resources, that's a great way to figure out, run a quick test and try to just, get something, right, to figure it out. Now, if you don't, and I've certainly been in instances where we did not have the time or resources to test, so I can totally sympathize with that. But if you don't, then try to frame the conversation around the user. And this comes from a place of not who's right or wrong, but what is right or wrong for our user. So by bringing the user into that kind of conversation, you are not framing it as you versus the designer, but you're framing it as you and the designer for the user. So it doesn't become what do I want, but instead it becomes what does our user want? What is best for the user? And you can let that kind of guide the conversation and see what happens. Of course, the world isn't perfect and we're not always going to know, but even if there is a difference of opinion and, it's just really hard, a lot of that tension, right? The tension that comes with talking through any conflict can come down because you're putting yourself on the same side as the designer with the same goal. So if you guys have the same goal, that tension may lessen a little bit, and you can really identify that you guys are just trying to problem solve, and that's it, and not necessarily argue a difference of opinion. Okay, if all else fails and your communication just is not cutting it, then I think it's totally fine to iterate. It's completely okay, and sometimes even encouraged to switch up your progress or your process. I do it all the time. Again, just as a reminder, when I'm talking about communication, I'm talking about every communication touch point, right? Any touch point is a place to always consistently improve and iterate. And so what you see here on the screen are just kind of a grouping of some screenshots from a team survey that I sent out a while ago after having tried out a new team meeting structure for a couple weeks. So put together, the structure in place. We tested it out for a few weeks, and then I sent out a survey where I asked questions to really understand how much value designers were getting out of our design critiques, whether they preferred synchronous or asynchronous stand-ups, how comfortable they felt giving and receiving feedback on their work, which meetings were most and least valuable, right? All things of that nature, all questions to just understand how we were doing, what's the temperature check on the team and our communication touch points. And so through that survey and analyzing the results, I learned what was working and what wasn't. We made a few adjustments and we move forward, right? We put those new adjustments in place, and then we kind of tested it again for another couple of weeks, and did the same thing over and over again. So I bring this up because I don't want anyone to think that surveys and interviews are only for your customers. They can be a really, really powerful and useful tool in learning how to communicate internally with your team and still see amazing results. So if we remember back to the design thinking visual from an earlier slide, a lot of what you see here and what we're talking about has really just been a reflection of that process, right? We've empathized by talking to them. We've defined what our strengths and weaknesses are. We've tested and iterated, right? through, or we tested, or I'm sorry, we ideated and prototyped through, through the design critiques, and then we iterated and implemented through the survey. So that's what I mean when I'm, really referencing that design thinking. I think that in any form of communication, whether it's with a designer, an engineer, a data analyst, even another product peer, anyone, I think, could really kind of take any of these ideas along that design thinking route and, just really try to improve communication on that note. So again, a lot of what you see is a reflection of that process just with your designers instead of with your users. And so with that, thank you for listening to me talk for a while. I'd love to open up the floor for any questions that you guys may have, or just kind of continue the discussion with everybody. Okay, well, if there are no questions, then I guess we can end it here. Guys, thank you all so much for joining. It was really a pleasure to just be able to present to you guys. I am always available if you have any questions about design and product and the intersection or communication or anything like that. You can feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or via email. But thank you again and have a really nice day.